In the autumn of 2022, Culturopolis, a conference co-organized by the Culture Institute of Barcelona and Culture Action Europe, brought together researchers, cultural workers, artists, and policymakers to exchange ideas and work around cultural rights.
During 4 days of discussions, presentations, workshops, and artistic programming, participants from near and far gathered to discuss access, cultural practices, innovations, and many more topics.
I'm Maya Weisinger from Culture Action Europe.
And I'm Marco Fiore from Michael Culture. Welcome to our 4-part series that explores the current discourse and practice around cultural rights in our communities across Europe. Today's episode focuses on cultural work, with an important focus on the right to work in the cultural sector under decent conditions. How is the work of artists and cultural workers valued and recognized? How can we ensure the economic, social, and environmental sustainability of cultural work and workers?
In this episode, we have an up-close look at the realities of artists and cultural workers across Europe and how they and their allies are fighting for their rights. Follow us in our journey. It all starts with Marco's walk.
75,000 steps. I walked 75,000 steps in the last 4 days, says my phone. The equivalent of 60 kilometers in 4 days. And I know very well why I reached this amount of steps. Not only did I walk around like a spinning top from one side of the Culturopolis conference to the other, it's mainly because I explored Barcelona, intrigued by the intersecting streets and the light and sounds that changed from time to time. And this exploration was not only physical. I came here to find out one very specific thing: how the cultural sector in Europe can be more sustainable. To do that, I talked to the people who are at the heart of this system. I definitely understood more about it.
To start, Marco sat down with Catherine, the head of the Cultural Policies Department in the European Commission Directorate General for Education and Culture. She also led the Innovation and Cultural Policy team of the European Commission Directorate General for Education and Culture. In 2018, she was at the head of the task force of the European Year of Cultural Heritage. As the deputy to the director and head of unit for cultural policies in the Commission, Catherine is an important part of the cultural landscape when it comes to co-creating a future that guarantees more rights for artists and cultural workers.
El Parallel Theatre. 2,300 steps counted. Catherine Magnan is a joy to see at the conference while she talks on the stage. I am inspired by the way she talks about things that it is obvious she knows inside out. It's nice to listen to someone who not only has a general insight, but at the same time has a capillary knowledge. It also helps that Catherine expresses herself fluently and straight to the point. When I'm told that she has agreed to be interviewed, I rush toward the inside of the room in the theatre. After the presentations and smiles, we are told that we can settle in the second floor. We go up some spiral stairs. We settle into the velvet sofas, and under an opaque light, we begin our recorded conversation. In the background, the sounds of the animated theatre. To kickstart, I want to outline the big challenges for cultural workers, especially artists, condition in which Catherine sees an inherent precariousness, as things stand right now.
Very few artists are in long-term permanent employment. They are dependent on contracts being signed for one performance or one painting to be sold or several, an exhibit to be agreed upon or not. So all that is short-term, unpredictable, and very difficult to plan in the long term. Then I think one specific challenge is also the dependency that artists and cultural professionals have from funders. Very few are permanent employees, so they need, all their institutions, the cultural institutions need to find funders, sponsors, and all that is, that is never, very, very long term. But also artists are dependent from the public. And that's a fragility and an inequality that that was highlighted by the COVID crisis. When you don't have an audience, what do you do?
Another specificity of the sector she identifies is that one of mobility. Artists and cultural professionals need to be mobile to perform, but more importantly, to grow.
That's why we have residencies, and that's why we launched this Culture Moves Europe, this new funding scheme under Creative Europe, because we know how important mobility is for artists to develop and grow. So all that is at national level within one country, but then you have also specific issues at the European level. We just talked about mobility. Well, if you want to be mobile at European level, it means that, you can have trouble with social security issues. They're not always portable, and it's complicated. It's super complicated. Then you can also have taxes issues. It's not very, sexy to talk about taxes, but it does happen. You have dance or musicians or whatever, companies performing in several countries and really facing major issues when it comes to either taxations on income or VAT when you cross borders, because it is not harmonized at European level.
This list of challenges, in combination with the conversations that have been happening all across the conference, lead us down a familiar path to the topic of a European status of the artist. While the idea of a status of the artist is not a new one, it took on a particular new light in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, which demanded the political attention around the working conditions of artists and cultural workers. Almost 2 years ago, the Committee on Culture and Education of the European Parliament called on the Commission to propose a European status of the artist, setting out a common framework for working conditions and minimum standards for all EU countries, while fully respecting member states' competencies on their labor market and cultural policy. Members of the cultural sector across Europe, such as Culture Action Europe, who even provided a background analysis for the Parliament's report, have been pushing for the status of the artist for years and believe the time to strike the iron is now. Catherine thoughtfully weighs in, clearly outlining where the Commission can and cannot support the movement.
A very appealing question, but it's also a difficult one. Why? Because we cannot do whatever we want at European level. We are limited by what is called competences. At the end of the day, those who decide are still the countries, the member states, and they decide together what they want to give at a European level. And culture, but also social security, taxes, those remain primarily national or regional competences. They are not given to the European level. I mean, in the field of culture, we cannot take legislation at all. It's just forbidden by the treaty. It is explicitly said, black and white. So we cannot come from the European level and impose a status for artists. But it's very interesting to see that things are changing, and they are changing because of the COVID.
And the major change at the European level that has occurred is the beginning of discussions at the national level of the status of artists. Catherine lists some examples.
At European level, it is now, there is this movement now whereby we see in several countries discussion, reflections and changes on the status of artists at the national level. Portugal adopted a status for the artists. Then a number of countries are working on the issue. In Belgium, they are revising this status. We will soon hear about, where Spain stands, but there are also, things are moving also there. Then you've got the Netherlands and Austria, which have started a fairness process for artists, and those are experiments with fair pay, fair remuneration in public contracts. So there is quite a movement in quite a few countries, and it is remarkable in the sense that it was not like that before COVID. And there is still a long way to go. As European Commission, what we can do is really to facilitate this exchange of good practices, to have the countries meet, talk between themselves, discuss those issues, and that in itself is already a contribution to the debate.
While I have her attentive ear, I ask her a question I'm sure she loves to hear. In her latest State of the Union speech, Ursula von der Leyen gave her backing for a constitutional convention to reform the EU treaties. Is this a way we could see a good change for culture?
Look, it's very good to reopen treaties, but when you reopen, and you never know what direction it can go. So let's hope for the better. The last times when the treaties were reopened, it was good for culture because, like with the Maastricht Treaty, we got a reinforced mention, etc. But I cannot predict whether it will translate into more competences or not. It's a question of, political forces and discussions underway. And I can tell you that by working on a daily basis with the representatives of our member states, it's quite clear that culture is for them really above all a national competence. Very often we are told as Commission, in our internal discussion, subsidiarity, which is a key word to say. We deal at EU level only with, what is necessary. We deal with some issues at EU level, maybe, but with some other issues at the national level. I really don't know what direction it could go, meaning could it give more power for culture at European level, I mean.
So, okay, while the topic of treaty reform still remains fuzzy, it is clear through speaking with Catherine that there is currently a momentum to secure things like minimum labor standards and social rights in the sector at the policy level. For many who have been working towards these goals, seeing effective and practical solutions put forward at the European level is still one of the most important focuses. One of such individuals is Noel Kelly. Noel Kelly, the director and CEO of Visual Arts Ireland, focuses much of his work on the social protection of visual artists. Through his ongoing advocacy, he fights for artists' rights and the development of an equitable system that supports artists at all stages of their professional lives.
El Molino Theatre. 34,500 steps counted. Noel is a witty talker. We exchanged a few emails when we decided where to meet. He is outside the El Parallel Theatre with a cigarette between his fingers, talking with Corinne, the coordinator of Michael Culture. And immediately I get drawn into a pleasant but endless conversation. I manage to pull Noel away. We have to do the interview. He suggests we go for a walk to find a quieter place. We start taking a very long walk through the streets of Barcelona, talking about what it's like to be in his position, how he sees the future for the artistic sector, and also about the next exhibition he wants to come and see in Paris. After half an hour of walking, I stop him. Noel, we have to do this interview. By this point in the conference, there have been so many overlapping conversations about the role and rights of artists. I decided to get right down to basics with Noel. What is an artist?
The idea for me of an artist is the person who creates art, whether or not it's painting, sculpture, music, or even writing, theatre, etc. They're using a conscious skill. They're using their creative imagination. An artist is an instrument, and it's an instrument. The artist as an instrument, expresses society, the emotions of society, the moment in society, the past, the future, gives us hope, makes us depressed. So the artist has so many different roles that we can say that what is an artist can be answered of, please tell me what is not art in contemporary society.
Yes, but I want Noel to go more concrete. I ask him to tell me about his extensive experience with the Irish government and how they try to frame the discourse with them.
In the Irish case, we don't have a definition of an artist anywhere in our legislation. What it has meant is that for the Irish government, we have spent a huge amount of time answering the question of how would I recognize an artist? When we are reduced to one of the definitions of what is art in Irish precedent, would the person sitting on a bus consider this art? I know myself that there are many things that I enjoy in the art world that no person in their right mind sitting on a bus would consider art. but it is always about the person on the street in all of the definitions. So therefore, the status of the artist inherently starts to codify this.
Niall talks about how the Irish government makes bridges between government departments, which makes policy decisions more commonly understood across different areas. By building a shared understanding for each other's work, he says, avenues of opportunity are created.
If we have policymakers talking to other policymakers and talking in an environment of actually the exchange of open ideas, then we have the opportunity first to lay a good bedrock of supports. But then there is the other thing of just finding the opportunities. And what I always say is advocacy is 95% opportunistic. So you have to be prepared for when that little conversation comes along. You can guide it. You can hope that you have guided it in a way, that it comes sooner than you imagine. But I think we have to get these conversations right, because what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening, in different countries in the world is certainly going to be putting our society under deeper pressure. And it's not a limitless pot of resources. And the first people to suffer are always the cultural sector. So what we have to do is we have to actually work very hard now to make sure the cultural sector isn't the first one to suffer. You cannot take your eye off the ball. We must make sure that we protect it and we also grow it.
We come to the issue of funding, obviously a hot topic in the conversation of the working conditions of artists. What can a long-term advocacy look like? In particular, advocacy had to deal with the impact of the pandemic, which was difficult for all society.
But during that time, certain governments found culture to be a centre point that should be supported, and supported in many different ways, because it was seen that culture is a very fragile sector. We depend so much on others in order for us to grow and flourish, and artists in particular. The Irish government put in place a lot of supports for individual artists and organisations. The level of funding for culture had been dropping and dropping and dropping since 2009 during the deep recession. Almost overnight, our cultural budget increased so much that the various funding bodies were able to fund in a way that they hadn't been able to fund ever in their lifetime. And there's obviously, a lot of advocacy to maintain funding at that level, but that puts a lot of pressure on us.
And at this point, Noel tells me a key element. There is a pressure because it's not just advocacy for funding alone that leads to growth in the sector, but working on how to effectively use the money.
This level of funding, we need to be using it towards increasing ambition, increasing the scale of work, and also increasing the number of opportunities for engaging with the variety of audiences. And we also need to be giving permission to experiment and to fail. The danger of the good times is that we have a waste of the money. So I think the challenge, and I think the advocacy that I am looking for, is that we step outside of our cultural sector and start to bring more people in who are expert in different fields to actually support the cultural sector. So I think our big challenge is now to sort of build those bridges between government departments, various industries, but to say that the relationship has changed. We should not give up our autonomy of creativity just for funding, as we have done in the past, but we should show the funders that their money, we give them permission to experiment. So it's not that they give us permission, we give them permission to experiment.
This dual value of advocacy is also something found in the networks such as Culture Action Europe, Michael Culture, and also NEMO, the most important network for museums at the European level. For this, Marco met with their Secretary General, Julia Pagel. Since 2019, she has also been a member of the EU Commission Expert Group on Cultural Heritage. Within NEMO, she advocates for a museum sector open to the new challenges of this century.
El Parallel Theatre. 58,000 steps counted. Julia is such an inspiration. It is difficult to imagine a person who manages to reconcile the image of leadership and at the same time open-mindedness towards everyone, as she does. At the Culture Action Europe Members Forum, that took place the day after the closing ceremony, I walked toward her, making my way through people, but also trying not to be weird about it. I interrupt her just as she is about to eat a small quiche from the buffet. Needless to say, she immediately shows kind willingness to participate. But let's take a step back. On the second day of the conference, Julia is on stage with a panel of top-notch speakers. What is the most surprising about her is that she manages to deliver every message she wants to the best of her ability. The audience is captivated. She's talking about the need for museums to become social power plants. Of all the things she says, one sticks to me particularly. Museums should be about somebody rather than only something. Julia is talking about a human-centered shift in the museums. This is a vision that deeply links the museum to its social value, and thus to the sustainability of its actions.
Well, I think that you call it human-centered shift. I actually like that framing. I think it leads to ultimately to more relevance of museums for the community. You could also say for society, because if museums really look at their collections from the perspective of the community, like what drives them, what occupies them, which stories do they have to share, then the identification with museums as places for me or with me will grow, and that will ultimately lead to a more sustainable museum, like in a social sense, because you can make use of a collective force of the community, but also in an economic sense, as being more relevant means more people visiting museums, more tickets are being sold. And that also means that you have more arguments as a museum to ask for government support, not only for museums' work in the culture sector, but also, for example, in the social sector or in the education sector, even in the economic sector.
And when it comes to the museum sector, its power to tell the story and shape it differently from time to time, the question of sustainability is central. A very simple example: multiculturalism and the decolonization that should result from it. And perhaps an answer for these nodes is offered by the concept of cultural democracy.
I think that cultural democracy means, among many things, giving a voice to everybody, especially the ones that might not have the loudest voice, and enabling them to speak up and share their views. And cultural heritage organizations such as museums can pave the way and be one of those channels that support decolonization and multiculturalism through, for example, revisiting their collections, looking at the stories and the people associated with them. And I think museums have this power to rewrite histories of violence and dominations that have been exhibited for a long time. And they can also bring back people's stories in the museums that have been erased through processes of curation, for example. But museums have to become better in becoming this place where everybody feels welcome and actually makes space and makes use of their spaces. So this process can really start with everybody.
And when we talk about involving everyone to activate in these processes, it is crucial that there are policies of openness. On the one hand, you have cultural democracy, which protects and promotes cultural diversity and active participation in the cultural life of the community. On the other hand, you have the democratization of culture, which means increasing openness and improving equality of access to culture. What is the priority of museums, according to Julia?
Can I say both? Seriously, I mean, I think that institutions like museums want to help society and practice cultural democracy, but they need first maybe to exercise to do the exercise to be those places where everybody feels reflected and welcome. Only then you can help society to practice cultural democracy. We are currently running on estimates that museums are visited by around 10% of the population. And that is not a lot. And if you look into that, the population is made up of a very homogeneous group of white older people. And I'm saying that there's a lot of museums, great museums, so there are exceptions everywhere, but this is the general picture. So I think the first step is really to democratize museums in the sense that they become places for everybody and not just for a few.
Making the museum a place for everyone. It is a discourse that echoes the raison d'être of the Sustainable Development Goals, making the world a better place for everyone. And the SDGs are a fundamental discourse, driving the whole conversation about social and environmental sustainability. Among all them, which is the one for which museums have more power to help?
Well, my preferred answer would be the SDG about culture, but that doesn't exist. And I think this is really a big loss. It's currently not the case. It's not only a loss for the sector itself, but it's also a loss for policymakers and society at large for not really making use of culture, the culture sector, and the power of culture as an ally. But if I had to choose from the existing ones, I would probably think number 11, which is sustainable communities and cities, because this is what museums are about. Although I think that museums can contribute to many of the goals in their specific way. So I wouldn't want to focus on just one, but rather trying to do the exercise and helping museums to find out how they can contribute in the smallest sense to any of the sustainable development goals.
Talking about sustainability, NEMO launched a survey to evaluate the status quo of European museums' transition and journey towards sustainability in a time of climate emergency. It has been presented to European Commission among other important organizations, and the results show how museums can be catalysts for a change in the good direction.
I think the main takeaway is that the sector is very aware of climate change and sees its potential to become an actor and also an ally in the green transition. But there are also still many obstacles to overcome, which are linked to work processes and infrastructure, which are really hard to change. I think museums need both financial support to make their operations and infrastructure more sustainable, but they also need more authority to take these decisions, as some of them are even unable to decide whether they want to have a green energy supplier or not. I would say another piece of good news is that museums that are part of climate-driven networks, and there are actually quite many in Europe and globally, that those museums that are part of these networks are usually doing much better in terms of climate activism and climate support, and also when it comes to knowledge, sustainable operations and infrastructure. So I think the message is don't really try and solve everything by yourself, but get help and use the wisdom and the power of the many and start being part of a network in here.
So far, we've talked a lot about how organizations and institutions can work towards improving the working conditions for artists. But what can they do to change themselves? For example, SHIFT is a project that provides training opportunities for cultural leaders and creates ways for them to come together and face global challenges such as climate change, gender equality, and inclusion of minorities. Luckily, Marco had the opportunity to talk with Katharina Weinert, the policy advisor at European Music Council, the organization coordinating the Shift Culture project.
Hotel lobby. 67,700 steps counted. I'm really excited about this next interview. Shift Culture is a project I've been tracking the results of for a while, almost since I started working at MCA. I know the main goals, and especially at MCA, we have been trying to implement some of its results. Katharina and I, we've known for 3 days that we have to do this interview. She's the last person I will talk to here in Barcelona. While beginning the conversation, she tells me how it all started. The initial idea was to tackle the sustainability issues the cultural networks face, with all their specificities. There were no trainings available, so the Partners Consortium decided to create their own tools to assess and improve the sector. Environmental sustainability, gender and power relations, and inclusion are the three main axes of work, but they added the cultural leadership as a transversal topic. Katarina has clearly in mind what are the main challenges in achieving sustainability in this domain.
Well, I mean, implementing change is a big thing, right? We are especially working in these institutions and associations. I think we're often a bit stuck in, we've always been doing it like that, right? Or maybe a lot of answers always, we once tried to do this and this thing. It didn't really work, so we're not going to do it again.
Also because when we talk about sustainability, we tend to focus on the environmental impact, but there is also the social aspects, such as the quality of the working environment and the mental health related to it. So they needed to change our perspective and focus on the specificities of these networks.
Really stepping out of our comfort zone, maybe, and finding new ways to work together, that can be a big thing. For example, if we look at the environmental sustainability aspect, because as European cultural networks, although like I said, we work in different areas of the cultural sector, all of us, but as networks, we have a few things in common. We are usually small teams of only a few people. We travel a lot over big distances across Europe. Most of us organize usually one big conference every year in a different place in Europe with different local partners. So that's often different conditions. So that's a very specific type of work. The concern that comes up most is, of course, the traveling. And there's a big concern, or even this might seem like a conflicting goal sometimes, because our main goal as cultural networks, European cultural networks, is to facilitate these cross-border exchanges.
Culture Action Europe, together with 15 other European cultural networks, launched the Shift eco-certification pilot phase since the Culturopolis conference. The aim of this process is to co-develop a bespoke eco-certification for cultural networks, taking into account their specific needs and working methods. And the process to get there started from the needs of the consortium partners, cultural networks, in turn with the help of experts. It was about lending a concrete hand to organizations similar to them.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not claiming that we have the solution. This is not the one and only way to do things, but it's really, for a lot of us, we don't even know where to start. There's often, for us, on many of those topics, and for many of our members that we talk to, there's like a big general willingness to work on these things, but it's often very difficult. I don't even know where to start. And we hope that with the tools that were developed in the projects and the different guidelines, toolkits and everything, that it makes that step easier.
Cultural leadership is a broad concept that can be interpreted and practiced in different ways. It can be seen twofold. Firstly, as the act of managing organizations in the cultural sector, and secondly, as leading through cultural lenses. There is no unique definition of what a leader should be. Katarina is very clear about the cultural leadership in the sector and why it was chosen as a transversal topic for the project dealing with sustainability.
So it's really more leadership is really a lot more about giving leaders of cultural organizations the tools to add values and find a path for their organizations. But of course, you have to be aware of the different paths that are there. And it's really about using different methods and tools to take everybody along the way, finding participatory tools for everybody to feel heard and take along in this process. Because if you really want to implement change, it's not going to be achieved by somebody on the top saying, so this is how we're going to do it now. It's really, cultural leadership is really about taking everybody involved along, making them also feel ownership of this, and that they're really part of the process.
And being part of the process also means understanding that, in the world of sustainability, everything is connected, and that improvements in one area will have a spillover effect on another sustainable development goal. If Shift focuses on SDG number 5, gender equality, number 10, reduced inequalities, and number 13, climate action, there will also be an impact on other SDGs.
Of course, there's a lot about also education. And of course, that also means we talk a lot about, in all of them, capacity building and developing new skills. Of course, when we talk about climate change, there are several of the SDGs that are related to this goal. In the materials that we use, it is about what we don't explicitly state as one of the SDGs we're working on, but about the whole idea of partnerships. That's, of course, very much ingrained in just our in being networks, obviously, but also different networks working together. So in our understanding, all of them are very much related anyway. Mm-hmm. An additional note on that, of course, there is no SDG on culture, so right, but we're trying to also, of course, show how much culture relates to many or even all of the SDGs, and how much of an impact the culture sector has on achieving the SDGs, either as tasks for what we have to do ourselves, but also because we can reach out to so many people, so in these two ways, culture is so strongly connected with the SDGs, even though it's maybe not explicitly mentioned as a goal or target itself.
Barcelona Beach. 75,000 steps counted. In my last moments here in Barcelona, I wanted to come to the beach, to watch the sea one last time. My steps sink warily into the soft sand. It is the classic setting in which you can reflect to draw conclusions. Building a sustainable cultural sector requires intentional steps, openness to diverse perspectives, balance, and a shared sense of purpose. And just as I walked through the streets of Barcelona, trying not to lose myself, but with the will of always discovering something new, we must continue to explore new paths and avenues, discovering new ways to make culture sustainable and accessible for all.
This podcast is a collaboration between Michael Culture Association and Culture Action Europe, two network organizations working towards sustainable, diverse, and central spaces for culture. The 4-part series is designed and edited by Maya Weisinger from Culture Action Europe and Marco Fiore from MCA. You can find the link for the sources in the description of this episode. For any comment or suggestion about these episodes, please write to Maya, M-A-Y-A, at cultureactioneurope.org.
Thank you for listening, and thanks to all the interviewees for participating in the making of this episode. The next episode will be about digital environments. See you in the next episode of Tales from Culturopolis.